So my topic is near to the discussion and to the elements you gave to us at the end of your speech, not the theoretical part, but the historical part. So my paper concentrates on the relation between the French history of the institution, of the end of the German legal theories of the same period that showed some proximity to institutionalism. In regarding first Otto von Gierke's writings, especially his treatise Das Deutsche Genossenschaftsrecht, published in the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, one can observe certain parallels between his doctrine of the corporation and institutional theory. The doctrine of the corporation gives primary place to the corporate organization of society, and it thus opposes the idea that it is the state alone which is responsible for legal creations. Society is understood as organized from the bottom up thanks to corporations, a term that enjoys a wider range of meanings than under the French Ancien Régime. German society organized into corporations from the Middle Ages up till the beginnings of the 19th century was under a process of constant evolution. Thus, the Genossenschaftsrecht passed through successive stages. The familial organization of the Middle Ages became a territorial kingdom, and then the sovereign state began to be established in the 18th century. From that point onwards, the state became a policed state, Polizeistaat, a term that has nothing to do with a police state, which suppressed or strictly limited all traditional German liberties. In Gierke's work, the state possesses a corporative personality. This organicist doctrine constitutes a response to legal positivism, or more especially, to the variant which considers that all law and rights derive from the state. For Gierke, the state is above all a social state, in a sense quite different to the contemporary use of the term, a state that encompasses the corporations and is based on them. There are several points of convergence between Gierke's views and those of Oriu. For Gierke too, the state is a social organization in Oriu's sense, an organization which must complete a ground project. However, where Oriu sees a universal mode of organization, Gierke sees a particularity of German law and of the spirit of the German people, which would possess some spontaneous tendency to create organizations such as the family or the commune. According to Gierke, these associations are endowed with a specifically German character that grants them in a particular dynamic. This nationalistic quality is the reason why Oriu had to distinguish his own work from the German theories that lie at the base of the theory of associative corporations. The question then emerges of the legal foundation of the associations and the institution. If one considers that the corporation is founded on a contract, one must admit that the social contract is the foundation of society. Hence, a satisfying answer must be found for the following question: how can a decision of the majority legally constrain the minority? To respond to that question, the German doctrine invents the theory of the complex act, rudiments of which can be found notably in Gierke's writings. The creation of the corporation thus comes about via a series of declarations of intention, through which the contracting parties commit to contributing to the realization of a common goal. These acts have several aspects. If one focuses on the early stage, that means before the construction of the common person, one finds a multitude of particular acts of the part of three individuals. But if one focuses on the late stage, one finds one act emanating from a global entity, Gesamtheit, which at that point has been put in place. However, for Gierke, what is at stake here is not a contract but a collective unilateral act. The acts that preceded the constitution of the community are incomplete inasmuch as they only become fully valid when the goal of their performance is reached, that is, when the corporation is created. The complex act, the founding act of the association, is, as Gierke puts it, the will of a group in becoming in a process of development, embodying itself and affirming itself through that very act. It is an autonomous act and not an act of private law, producing legal rules which constrain third persons. The doctrine of the complex act allows German jurists to give a legal explanation for the construction of the Confederation of North Germany in 1866. A priori, the complex act resembles a contract. However, in a contract, the demands of each contracting party are opposed to each other, whereas in the complex act, each party's interests are not opposed to the others. To define this form of act, the Germans use the term convention, Vereinbarung, and not that of contract. The differences are evident. All the individuals who participate in such an act do not have equal power to produce the desired legal result. The common characteristic of complex acts are precisely the declaration of intention on the part of the contracting parties have to fuse together at a certain moment to produce a legal result. Oriou is particularly struck by the theory of the complex act. He examines it in depth in L'Institution et le droit statutaire of 96, because it provides him with explanatory models that can be used in his own theory of institutions, or which are very close to those that he elaborates himself. However, he departs from the German analysis and he resolves certain problems that they pose according to their own authors. According to Oriou, the German theories, notably in the form that Gierke gave them, are not capable of explaining how the common will of actors can bring about facts endowed with legal efficacy. For him, Gierke's position, which considers individuals as the agents of the collective person, does not provide any response to the problem of what to do when there are dissident wills. How can a decision taken by the majority have legal consequences in the case in which the members of an assembly are considered merely as the agents of a moral person? The will of a single moral person can only be a united will. In France, certain jurists like Plagnol, Sallet, Capitan, and Duguy developed a theory quite close to the theory of the complex act. This was the theory of the juridical act. Oriou found it to be inaccurate, first of all, because there are juridical facts that can be involuntary. The primordial defect of the contemporary definition of the juridical act is that it accords a primary role to subjective will and dismisses factors that arise from duration. Indeed, the theory of the juridical act does not succeed in accounting for the phenomenon of the creation of a society or a corporation via a series of actions. In the end, what Oriou did not approve of was this theory's incapacity to explain what happens voluntarily or involuntarily outside any juridical formality. He prefers the German theory of the complex act because it recognizes the role of procedure, of social ceremony and external relations, thus allowing a fuller comprehension of the social reality of institutions. Oriu recognizes that Gierke comes very close to his own explanation of the birth of institutions. But in his eyes, Gierke attaches too much importance to the collective personality which is given to the group. For Oriu, what matters is not the existence or non-existence of a juridical personality of the group formed by the agents, but rather the operation, the procedure that indicates the life of the institution. His position, therefore, does not consist in admitting the existence of complex acts, but is founded on the existence of complex procedural operation. The members of the deliberative assembly are bound not by a contract, but by participation in the procedure. In this case, the procedure that organizes the deliberation. Finally, his conception of the juridical act allows him to elaborate a theory of statutory law. In the end, it is the institution that defines the individual status of each of the elements that composes it. This approach allows Oriu to refute the German theory of the moral personality and to thus avoid some of the difficulties that the latter suffers. In particular, the German doctrine cannot allow an organ of the state, which is a moral person, to have its own proper competence. In contrast, Oriu suggests that an organ has rights concerning its function. It possesses a statute. If the superior power violates the statutory rights of the organ, the latter has legal recourse against an abuse of power. It is this side of the question that the German doctrine cannot account for, because it is a doctrine founded on the concept of the moral personality of the state. Oriu rules out all metaphysical elements within his institutional theory. He considers that the institution and statutory rights are bound slowly to real facts, and on this basis he opposes the idea of moral personality. Statutory rights for him are positive and active rights, opposable rights, something the German theory was not capable of recognizing. This is exactly where Oriu's conception differs from that of Pierre Jelinek's. According to Oriu, the latter did not succeed in giving precise content to the subjective rights of citizens. For his part, Jelinek, whilst defending his point of view, criticizes the 1789 Declaration of the Rights of Man for having created individual rights whilst ignoring the nature of the state. According to Jelinek, the state possesses a moral personality. Therefore, it can be a titulary holder of subjective rights, public subjective rights, and it thus possesses legal enjoyment of those rights. Another German author who dealt with this question, Gleitzmann, proposed a version of the complex act theory that provided a solution to this problem. The different declarations of intention, independent of each other, but aiming at the same result, constitute a juridical state of affairs, juristischer Tatbestand. They produce a legal consequence in a manner analogous to that of an individual unilateral act. Each member of the group thus contributes within the limits of their quota part to the production of the legal consequence. This explanation avoids the trap of the fusion of wills, which cannot explain decisions taken by majority, and it dismisses metaphysical constructions like the existence of a common will produced by multiple individual declarations of intention. This variation of the German doctrine attracted Oriu's attention. Indeed, he advanced the idea that the actor's wills produced legal consequences thanks to a procedure engendered by the functioning of the institution itself. By the same token, he rejected the theory of a supposed pre-existent moral personality within the institution, which, according to certain German public law theories, could be considered as the author of the complex act. the legal consequences are produced by the incorporation of actors consent to the preceding fact by their adhesion to the procedure. The majority's capacity to make a decision that binds the minority is explained in a similar manner. The minority, by continuing to sit beside the majority in Parliament, aligns itself with the procedure envisaged by the institution and accepts the latter's results. The theory of the complex act is closely related to that of the juridical personality. Formulating during the 19th century, first of all within the domain of private law thanks to Savigny, this theory has its roots in Roman law, and its stature is thus close to that of a fiction in the sense this term had in Roman law. It gives primary importance to the will of the human person, who alone can produce juridical acts. In its organistic version, the theory of juridical personality considers that the social group, the corporation for example, is an organism endowed with its own will. It acts via its organs, which are the equivalent of the members of the human body. But this conception posed problems, especially concerning the responsibility of the association as a moral person. It is quite difficult to attribute civil responsibility to an association if one considers it to be a fictive being. Gierke rejected the theory of fiction and considered, on the contrary, that corporations are real collective persons. He thus elaborated a different theory of the moral personality to that of Savigny. Human communities are autonomous groups recognized by law, and as such are holders of rights and duties. But this kind of phenomenon cannot be explained via a simple extrapolation of the rights of individual persons. What is required, according to Gierke, is an account of a new juridical system, the law of associations, the Genossenschaft, which is superior to individual law. This is how to explain the formation of the will of the moral person. An organ on the association speaks in its name, and doing so, it expresses the general sentiment of the moral person, not its particular will. The question then arises of the statute of agents of the state. Are they authentic representatives? At the 19th century, the German public law doctrine adopted an organistic view of the state, which allowed the power of the state to be detached from a person, in this case that of the king, and attributed to an organism as a whole. This conception ended up leading to the affirmation of a state sovereignty. According to Gierke, the people are the visible body of the state. Another question that then arises, that of the relationship of the parts to the whole to which they belong. According to the then dominant doctrine amongst the German public law theorists, members of a whole cannot be endowed with a function of representative in the private law sense. That is, that an authorized representative, a Stellvertreter, in no case does the representative represent the whole, no more than the eye or hand represent the person. It is the person himself who acts via the intermediary of the hand, the mouth, or the eye. Oriu extends and develops this vision. His theory, presented in 1916, attributed a double nature to the person institution. An institution has both a subjective personality and an objective personality. Each member really represents the group, and this is not a question of a fiction, but of reality. In his principles of public law, he considers that the moral person, the state or corporation, rather than being like a juridical body, is a juridical body. Within this explanation, he advances the idea that the organ exercises a function in the name of the objective individuality of the moral person. As such, if one takes the example of the state, the Chamber of Deputies or the Senate are organs of the nation when they maintain the direction of the national function. Oriu thus corrects the German organicist theory, making it more capable of accounting for political representation. However, there are certain configurations that are difficult to account for within the framework of organicist theory. How can one admit, for example, that organs of the same organism could be in disagreement? According to Gierke's position, when such a case occurs, it is power or force, Macht, which will have to decide the conflict. In the end, this signifies that the organization of the association was not initially created by law, but rather then the law gives an a posteriori sanction to a pre-existing factual situation. Here, Gierke's Germanist conception, which gives primary importance to the functioning of corporations or collective bodies, rejoins Oriu's conception. Oriu admits that the balance of force within an institution is a practical synthesis based on power. He writes, it is a citation, one of the forces dominates the others, and its power is moderated by the latter's resistance. Nevertheless, it determines the structure and direction of the whole. It is in this manner that within a deliberative assembly, the majority dominates the minority. Of course, what remains to be determined is whether power has the same origins and meaning for the two authors. What is at stake in this investigation is not an exhaustive analysis or use of moral personality. Rather, the question is to determine the relation between his theory and its German twin, and to underline the differences between the two. For Oriu, the German version of the theory of moral personality cannot satisfy the French individualistic spirit, because it does not prove the existence of a subjective unity of the moral person. Applied to the state, the German theory of juridical personality leaves aside the entire question of the objective foundation of the state, and yet the state, like all moral personalities, like associations, like commercial societies, is founded or will be objectively founded by various forces that work towards its edification, by the government, by international influences, by the activity of its own national citizens. The French spirit needs an explanatory model that reveals and highlights the delegation of powers from the base, the people or the nation, to their representative. This proof, according to Oriu, is lacking from the German theory. This is precisely where the advantage emerges of the Rousseauist model adopted by the French thinkers. The opposition between the two visions, that of Oriu and that of Gierke, becomes particularly apparent when one compares de la Personnalité comme élément de la Realité sociale and das Wesen der menschlichen Verbände. In the latter text, Gierke declares his opposition to the individualist theory defined by the professor of Toulouse. Gierke argues that life of the nation and of society constitutes a superior order within which individual life is incorporated. Oriu reproached Gierke and his school with returning to the position of the glossators, who used a fiction to construct subjective personality of the basis of individuality. In his eyes, these theories, which posit an act of will at the creation of a new foundation or group, are subjective interpretations that implicitly presuppose the existence of the moral personality of the foundation before its very creation. Orius sought to understand the creation of an institution or corporation as a process that could be explained in an objective manner. A theory that attributed a pre-existing moral personality was guilty in his eyes of engaging in metaphysical speculation. His theory, in contrast, was objective, even physical. It posited the corporation's will as something that emerged after its foundation. As such, the foundation of a society is a procedural operation constituted from a series of objective facts and from the adhesion of participants to those facts. Generally speaking, the continual reproach that the professor of Toulouse addressed to the German doctrine was its destruction of liberty and its culmination in an absolutist conception of the state. Orius does not admit the autonomous activity of superior being, the state. The juridical order, he tells us, will not be conditioned by the subjective activity of the state. Rather, it will be conditioned by the activity of its own elements who will spontaneously conform to the type of corporative person so as to bring it into being. So, up till this point have been reconstructing Orius' perception of German authors and his critics. It is the case that he always sought to identify within German doctrines elements that could be useful for his own theoretical constructions. Sometimes he found himself in agreement with the German authors, even if at first sight such agreement was far from evident. Now we will examine how the theory of the institution was received by two of German authors between the wars. Despite the many differences between their approaches to social and juridical phenomena, French and German specialists in public law had actually attempted to deal with the same social phenomenon, that is, the appearance of interest groups which are distinct, organized, and antagonistic within the society of their epoch. They tried to find a solid theoretical expression for the increasingly independent, for the appearance of a civil society that made continual political demands, that was increasingly independent of the state, and yet which nevertheless had to be integrated into the latter. Rudolf Smendt's work is particularly interesting in this regard. In the 1920s, he devised a theory of integration, which was quite close to Orius' theory of institutions. At the end of the 20s, Smendt belonged to a group of specialists in public law who were profoundly hostile to the then dominant juridical positivism. With Erich Kaufmann and Carl Schmitt, Smendt belonged to the conservative right who criticized the Weimar regime. These influential authors recommended the establishment of a popular state that would surmount class conflict and, in Smendt's case, restore the monarchy. According to Smendt, the principal function of the state is the integration of the individual and social groups within society. A state which cannot fulfill this task will necessarily have failed, and in his eyes the Weimar Republic found itself in this situation. There are remarkable analogies between this theory of integration and Orius' theory of institutions. More precisely, the theory of integration proposes to study the relation between the individual and the social world, soziale Welt. Its immediate object is the individual as member of society, but at the same time, this theory studies the community, the group, the state, not as a closed ensemble with a fixed identity, but as inscribed within a dialectical relation between the whole and its parts. Sment distinguishes three forms of integration. Personal integration takes place thanks to the person of the monarch, the political leader, or even the civil servant who manages public affairs. Functional integration takes place thanks to certain procedures like election or parliamentary sessions, which contribute to the formation of the consciousness of belonging to a political community. And finally, material integration takes place thanks to the symbols of public life, the flag, or the political ceremonies. Germany in the 1920s was a state subject to enormous political, social, and economic tensions, but also tensions due to the specific form of the federal state, tensions between the federal state and the federated states. In this context, the state, via appropriate procedures, must integrate society and incorporate centrifugal elements within the collective ensemble. In Sment's views, there are two possible forms of political integration: dynamic integration, carried out by parliament, elections, political debates, in short, via the republican and democratic institutions. And then there is a static integration within the framework of a monarchical political system, which integrates individuals, for the most part, by means of symbols, history, and international coalitions formed through royal dynasties. Sment recognizes that integration is successfully carried out in France by the parliament, which, thanks to the stability of its procedures, manages to give minorities the possibility of having their voice heard within institutions. But in Germany, the parliament is not capable of responding effectively to this demand. On this point, Sment reflects a distrust of parliament, which is quite frequent amongst the 19th and 20th century specialists of public law. According to Sment, the state is capable of guaranteeing the integration of society thanks to the constitution, which is not only the written constitution, a text whose task is organize the function of the state. He is against this ordinary positivist conception of constitution. In truth, the constitution is a process of setting up and accepting a political ensemble. It is not a piece of paper, as Lassalle used to say, but it does express a country's real relations of power. This dynamic conception of constitution reminds one of Hegel's conception presented in the Elements of Philosophy of Right. One cannot talk of constitutions without addressing the question of the formation of a general will that expresses the realization of the fundamental agreement to the people concerning its constitutions. Sment's conception of general will is quite close to that of Oriou. The general will is a dynamic element which is constantly renewed. It is an everyday plebiscite, as Renan said, of the nation. Without the existence of a unified will of the people, the state cannot exist or would be a pure tyranny. The theory of the state developed by Sment is thus resolutely anti-individualist. He considers that the state's primary task is to guarantee the integration of the people, an integration that is possible thanks to its power of sovereign decision, which imposes unity and general cohesion. In contrast, and in opposition to the state, associations do not possess a significant power of integration. They are merely auxiliary means employed with regard to particular ends. The power of decision is the moment that installs and demonstrates the sovereignty of the state as an integrative force. The decision marks out its action from the interested activity of social groups, and notably those of representative instances within the parliament. Such conception of integration is therefore incompatible with the idea of localization of powers. It can neither allow the different powers to emerge from a unique sovereign person, whether the people or the monarch, nor can it allow the principle of the separation of powers. What is also immediately evident, despite their similarities, is the difference between the theory of integration and Oriu's conception of the institution, which admits both the separation of powers as well as national sovereignty. In his 1912 work on national sovereignty, Oriu does not contest the illusory nature that national representation might have. Nevertheless, the professor of Toulouse insists on the means of control and mutual pressure that the different powers can exercise over each other, such that in the end the governmental process is the complete ratification of the general will and the manifestation of sovereignty. Oriu too recognizes the delicacy and fragility of the idea of representation of one single by three separate powers. To surmount this difficulty, he considers that the three powers must be conceived as diverse capacities of one and the same will. One can conclude that the role of the three powers within the state is thus entirely different in Oriu and Smeth's work. For the former, they are channels for expressing national will, whilst for the latter, they are the state's means for expression and integration. Smith writes, "It is the formation of these organs in their existence and their activity which conforms to the constitution that the state both lives and is personally integrated." And now the second author, of which I will speak, it's Schmidt. So, Schmidt is a contemporary of Smith and quite close to him politically, does refer to Oriu notably in the glossarium, as known, in 1947-48. He wrote, "I am again astonished by my intellectual kinship with Oriu. In that man I recognize my older brother." Indeed, from 1933 onwards, Schmidt takes up in his own terms the theory of institutions. But avoiding the use of the term institution, he speaks rather of concrete thinking of order. This rallying to institutionalism corresponds to a modification of his own understanding of law. Up till 1933, the Schmittian conception of law is bipartite. He opposes normativist thinking and decisionist thinking. This distinction, which is notably made in political theology, defines these two types of juridical thinking in the following manner. Whilst the pure normativist, in Kant by Kelsen, believes in the impersonal nature of juridical norms, the decisionist emphasizes the decision which settles controversial disputes and installs a stable political situation or constitutional order. In this sense, Hobbes belongs to the decisionist tendency, according to Schmidt, because he declares in the Latin version of the Leviathan that auctoritas non veritas facit legem. Schmidt reproaches juridical positivism, the dominant doctrine under the Second Reich and under the Weimar Republic, with sacrificing law to a blind normativism which does not base itself on natural law or rational law, but solely on factual reality. Consequently, normativism was incapable of generating clear responses to significant judicial problems of the epoch. It was nothing more than a simple operating rule for state bureaucracy. Public law thus abandoned the task of defining what was allowed to the normative force of the factual, the normative kraft des Faktischen. In 1933, in the preface to the second edition of the Political Theology, he considered the evolution of his thinking. In his view, normativism, which made the norm into the supreme value, opposed abstract norms to the order announced by the political leader or the monarch. Normativism thus elides the moment of decision, which ineluctably makes its necessity known in extreme situations. But on the other hand, decisionism runs the risk of missing the stable content inherent in any great political movement, precisely because it privileges the sudden moment of decision. Henceforth, Schmitt will oppose a third position to these two unilateral positions, the institutionalist type. He then recognizes that he owes the discovery of this third type of judicial thinking to his reading of Oriou. The crucial difference between these three types of thinking lies in the fact that whilst normativism is an impersonal and objective mode of thinking, and decisionism a necessarily personal mode of thinking due to the role it assigns to the leader, institutionalism is suprapersonal. The institution or the concrete order depends neither on persons nor on pre-established norms, but evolves at a higher level inside suprapersonal institutions. As mentioned earlier, Schmitt rarely uses the term institution. He prefers that of concrete order. The concrete order is a normal or normalized word. He approaches normativism with wishing to substitute a self-sufficient normativity for normality. In thus elides the distinction between order and disorder. In the end, the normativist doctrine is quite foreign to reality. Moreover, the functioning of the concrete order is described in quite allusive manner in the three types of juristic thought. The family, the clan, or the corporation form an institution that lives and organizes itself according to its own representations, which must be accepted if not adopted by the judge or the legislator. What is immediately clear here is Schmitt's persistent opposition to the normativist conception of law. In his eyes, the modification of the norm is the consequence rather than the cause of the change in social order or reality. As noted earlier, he principally defines institutionalism by way of its opposition to two other types of juristic thought. The principal contribution of the institutionalist doctrine thus lies in the ability to surmount both decisionism and positivism. According to Schmitt, the idea of concrete order is perfectly illustrated by the Hegelian theory of the state. The state is not the norm of norms in a normativistic perspective, nor a sovereign decision of a Hobbesian type, but the institution of institutions, the one that includes all other institutions and orientates them. It is not difficult to understand why at this precise moment Schmitt preferred the thought of concrete order to the other two types of thought. It is evidently because it seemed to be that the concept of concrete order offered more appropriate basis for the National Socialist vision of the state. The mode of thinking of concrete order offered the possibility of explaining and justifying the action of political leader, of a leader beyond any legal control, and especially the long-term establishment of this power beyond norms. Any type of legal thinking dominated by the opposition between norm and commandment, between lex and rex, cannot legally account for the idea of the Führer, he says. But one must avoid any summary interpretation. The Führer at stake here is the king of Prussia of the 19th century. It is not, at least directly, this one of the Third Reich, even if it is possible to consider the National Socialist conception of the Führer as the horizon of Schmidt's argument. Thus, the idea of the concrete order, by positing the incontestable existence of such a leader, attributes to this leader the role of being the principal origin of law, jurisdiction, and military regulations. By way of consequence, this vision is not compatible with the system of the separation of powers. In 1933, in his work, Schmidt declares that National Socialist thought is not abstract thought. In this sense, it is the enemy of normativism. National Socialism protects the true substance of the people wherever it encounters it, whether in the countryside, Landschaft, the lineage or race, Stamm, or in the corporation. Consequently, National Socialism is a movement which bases itself solely on concrete realities, on institutions, instead of developing abstract considerations about norms. In actual fact, the theory of concrete order, institutionalism, in its Schmittian version, offers the possibility of creating a new juridical model that is entirely adequate to the reality of National Socialist state, starting from the basis of the concept of concrete order, that is, from the current situation of the people and the organization of the state. Schmidt can propose substitutes for abstract principles like good moral character, good faith, substitutes like discipline, direction, honor, and loyalty, which, once situated in the context of the National Socialist state, give a complete freedom of action to the political leader, which we know. The context of juridical concepts is thus modified to better adapt to political reality. The law, Schmidt says, is no longer an abstract norm which refers to a past will. The law is the will and the project of the political leader. As project, the law is the present and the future, and has surmounted the difference between legislative and executive power, between lex and rex. Here he is making allusion to the law of full powers, Ermächtigungsgesetz, which in 1933 attributed to the executive power, practically speaking to the Chancellor, Hitler, the possibility of promulgating laws without consulting the legislative body. Schmidt thus bases the concrete order on a decision of the political leader, which puts an end to disorder and to the Weimar Republican regime, due to the Weimar Republican regime. Although from this point onwards, Schmidt claims to be influenced by Oriu, the difference between the two versions of institutionalism is evident. In the three types of juristic thought, Schmidt praises Oriu as the observer of the reality of a concrete order, as it happens that of the Conseil d'État, State Council, which created French administrative law. This allowed him to another opportunity to denounce the abstract thought of normativism. But it is quite a peculiar conception of the institution that Schmidt develops, in which Führer and people are not two parties to a contract, but forces whose task is to realize a common project. In this project, the institutions of control, such as the tribunals, occupy a particular place. They are required to exercise their function not by applying the laws voted by the Parliament, but in having recourse to notions of loyalty and obedience, of discipline and honor, thus to extra-legal notions which refer to a specific ideological system and political context. It is quite legitimate for us to think that what we have here is an instrumentalization of the theory of institutions designed to serve immediate political objectives. Evidently, one cannot sum up in a simple manner the interactions between French institutionalism and the German public law doctrine, such as present in the authors mentioned here. Nevertheless, if it was a matter of identifying the common denominator, it no doubt could be found in their anti-individualist position and their hostile attitude towards the advances of French Revolution. It is exactly this element that explains the interest they have for each other's work, and which allowed Sment and Schmidt to appropriate Oriul's work. But there is the difference that Oriul never rejected the principles of the revolution. So thank you.